Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 4, and this lesson, we're going to be covering class libraries. This is a really important lesson because you'll be using class libraries going forward pretty much the rest of your career. Class libraries are awesome. This is where we're going to store most of our code. And so we finally start making our applications into what I would call real-world applications. So far, we've put our code right in the console application. And the console application is a user interface project. And that's not really best practice, except for small little applications because of the fact that it's not reusable. So if you have to change user interfaces, let's say you move to a WinForm application or a WPF application, you have to redo all of your code. But with class libraries, we can correct all of that. So let's open up Visual Studio and go File, New Project. Let's start with a console application that we'll call Console UI, and this is the class library demo. And the first thing we do here is we add our console.readline at the end. So we've been putting code right in our console or in our program class, or we've been putting it into their own class files. But moving forward from this day on, I want you to concentrate on putting only the code that's important for the user interface itself in the UI. And what I mean by that is, if you have to do a console read line or write line, that goes in the console application. But everything else goes into your class library. That way you can reuse it later. So let's see what a class library is. And this is fun because it's our first time to create a different project type. And it's our first time to have two different projects in one solution. So on our solution, the very top line, right click and say Add New Project. And instead of console application, the next one down is class library .NET Framework. Make sure it says .NET Framework. We're not moving into .NET Core yet. So .NET Framework is the way to go. And then down here, we give it a name. Notice there's no solution name down here because we already have one. We're just adding another project to the solution. Remember that solutions just hold our projects together. Different projects that kind of relate to each other, it holds in the same spot. That's really all a solution does. So our project, let's call this Demo Library. Now that's not a very specific name, but it is pretty much what it's going to cover. This is a demonstration library, and so it's going to house all of our different demo code. If you had a more specific purpose for your library, you could call it something more specific. Typically, libraries are pretty general. But if you want to name things that make sense. So be careful on that. It's a balancing act, and naming is hard. So think it through and try and pick the best, most descriptive name. In this case, it's all about demos that I'll be doing. So I'm going to make it Demo Library. Now, the other part of this is, and this is my personal convention, but I always add the word library at the end. And what that does is it tells me that this is a class library. creating my own template and just removing this from the template because it's not good. We never want to call a class class 1. And you could say, well, you know what? We could rename this and call it person model. Great. Cool. What's the name of the file? Class 1. Oops. So you go, oh, well, we got to change it over here. Yes, you do. You got to change it in both places. And actually, if you change it over here, it should prompt you. Sometimes it does. If you've already changed it over here, it won't. But sometimes it'll prompt you and say, do you want to rename the class too? And you say yes, and that's cool. But it's so easy to get wrong. So my recommendation, right-click on it and delete it. Just delete it. And that's my go-to every single time, even now, as a developer with decades of experience. It's kind of scary to say decades with a plural. But even with that much experience, I still delete class 1. I just found it's easier than renaming and risking mistaking which one to do for rename. And then I cause a problem. Okay, so I always just delete it and I start over. Now let's create a couple of things in here. First, I'm going to create a folder for models. Now also create a new class, create a couple of them. The first class is right in the root. I'm going to call this calculations. Calculation. I'm going to get public, and I'll even make it static. And the first calculation is going to be the add method we've been doing for a while. So public static double add, double x, double y. And we are going to say double output equals 0, output equals x plus y, return output. All right, and there's our calculation the .NET framework. And there's a lot. Okay? You can add a bunch of fun stuff in here. But the reality is we don't need any of this stuff. What we need is our demo library. Over here on the left, it says assemblies. That's what's currently open. That's by default. But the next one down is projects. If you click on that, you see demo library. If I hit the checkbox here and hit OK, that will add a reference in my console user interface to the library. Notice it now says demo library is a reference. What that allows me to do is if I come back over here and I say person model, it still yells at me, but if I hit Control Dot, it says go ahead and add a using demo library dot models. That's the namespace it's in. Now we're cool. Okay, so person dot, there's first name and there's last name. So that is how you add a reference to your class library. However, and this is something that takes a couple minutes to think about to make sure you wrap your mind around, we did not add a reference in demo library to console UI. And in fact, we can't. If I try and check this box right here and hit OK, it gives me this error right here. A reference to console UI could not be added. Adding this project as a reference would cause a circular dependency. Always read your error messages. What does a circular dependency mean? Well, to understand that, you have to understand how the build system works. So in our console application, when we say build solution, which if we hit start, that's essentially saying build solution and then start debugging it. That's essentially what's happening. So if we say build solution, what happens is it says, I'm going to build console UI, but console UI has a dependency on demo library. So it says, I can't build console UI and make sure that everything is set up correctly until I know what demo library provides to see if it has all the right information for demo library. So it comes down to demo library and it says, okay, I'm going to build demo library. It builds demo library, and then once it's done, it knows all about demo library. Then it can come up to console UI and create console UI with that dependency on the now built demo library. If, however, demo library depended on console UI, when console UI went to build, it says, I depend on demo library. It'd come down here and say, well, you can't build me either because I depend on console UI. And it's a circular dependency, meaning it would never be able to build because they're both dependent on the other being built first. The other thing to note is, let's just build this real quick. If I right click on console UI and say open folder in File Explorer, and then I go to the bin folder and debug. Now it's debug because right up here, it says the solution configuration is set to debug. That's what we're building in. The difference between debug and release, the two standard options, are that debug will allow us to, once a variable is used, it doesn't get destroyed until the end of its context. Whereas in release mode, it gets destroyed as soon as it's done. It's a subtle difference, but it's an optimization. And there's a few other optimizations that happen in release mode that make it more compact, more memory efficient, more overall efficient, but that make it harder to debug. And so in debug mode, it has a few more things to help us debug. So we just normally build in or run it in debug mode when we're building our application. When we deploy it somewhere, we deploy in release mode. So that's kind of the difference. So when I built it, it created in the bin folder a debug folder. And inside there, you'll see some files. One of them is called console.ui.exe. Sound familiar? That's our project name, also our namespace name, and it's actually also what's called an assembly name. And so console UI is our assembly name, or the name of the application being built. And it adds exe on the end because it's a user interface project, a desktop user interface project. And so console applications create executable files. Now then we have a config file. We haven't dealt with that yet. We have a PDB file. The PDB file is used for debugging when you're not in Visual Studio. You can use this file to essentially map back to our code after it's built and compiled into this executable. Then notice this file right here, demolibrary.dll. What is that? That is our class library. So our class library is not a user interface, and when it gets built into a DLL file. A DLL file is a library file. It can be used by other applications like console.ui.exe, but it can't be run on its own. And then finally we have demolibrary.pdb. So when it went to build our overall solution, it said console UI depends on demo library. Build that first, create the DLL, bring it over into our project, and then build console UI. Once you do that, then put console UI and its dependencies, in this case, demolibrary.dll, into the debug folder. Now, the one thing you don't find in this folder, remember if we expanded out our references, there's a whole bunch of references over here that aren't in our folder. Why is that? Well, these references over here come with the .NET framework. On your computer is installed the .NET framework. And that's a bunch of DLLs that can be used by your application and don't have to be brought with your application. So you don't have to bring 10, 15, 50, 100 files with you in order for your application to run. However, that does mean you have to have the .NET framework installed in order to be able to run your application on a machine. Okay? Now, as one quick side note, if I double click this exe, yes, it does open up the console, which right now it's not doing anything. That's outside of my debugger. You can actually copy this, the config, and the DLL file and take them somewhere else and run them. No problem. Okay? Now that really is all there is to class libraries. Once you understand adding a reference, then everything else is just like it's in your normal application. You create the right using statement for the right namespace, and you're good to go. So that's all there is. Now remember, you have to add the using or the reference in your user interface. And this is where my naming scheme comes into play a little more. If you right-click on references and say add reference, go to projects, if it does not say library at the end, don't check the box. That's my way of double checking to make sure that my project that I'm adding is in the correct direction. User interfaces reference libraries. Libraries do not reference user interfaces. Okay, so you do not add a reference in your library to a user interface. You could reference a different library, but you can't reference you should not reference a user interface. And sometimes people get kind of confused in that and say, well, how would I ever send information back? And the key is the demo library doesn't. It doesn't initiate something. If you want information, you start the user interface. The user asks for something, or the application says, oh, I need something, and it goes and gets it. Okay? You don't start from your class library and send information up. Now, we will get deeper into class libraries and all the fun things you can do with them, but the reality is this is the foundation on which all of our applications are built, class libraries. This is how we share data. I mean, look at what Microsoft did. They created a DLL that has the system namespace, where it has a system code. So, for example, I believe it has the system.console .write line and read line. Now, it may be in .core, but I don't think so. I think it's in just system. So they create a DLL, and they just copied that DLL everywhere they needed it. So in every Windows computer in the world that has .NET Framework has the console user interface code. So we don't need to recreate that. We don't need to figure out how to write to the console by creating the window and then putting creating a cursor and then typing out thing. No, we just make a little call and it does it. Done. So we can reuse that over and over again. And that's the purpose of these libraries. One of the things that newer developers often get stuck on is the idea of a user interface being tied to the action they want to do. So the most common one I hear is, well, how do I do data access in WPF or ASP.NET or in WinForms? And the reality is, my answer is, you don't. You do that work in the library, and then it doesn't matter what user interface you do it with. And we're going to start seeing this as we start building full applications. In fact, the next module is on building a full application. And we will disconnect our class library from our user interface so that if we wanted to, we could take this DLL that this creates and we could put it in a different project. In my C# application from start to finish course, I spend 25 hours building an application that uses a WinForm front end, the user interface. But then I created 2 add-on courses, one for WPF and one for ASP.NET MVC. In each of those add-on courses, they were very short, and even though I spent a lot of time on talking through the user interfaces, I believe it was like 7 hours and 9 hours were all I spent on those 2 courses. And what they did is replaced the WinForm user interface with a different user interface. I changed almost 0 code when I swapped out those user interfaces. I just added a different user interface. The data access code, the business logic, all of my standard functions that I created or methods I created, they were all left intact because they were all in a class library. So I'm really Learn that, you will save yourself a ton of time down the road. Now, I do want to show you one bug you're going to run across. It's not a bug, but it's one you're going to think is a bug or a problem, and it's not. But I want to show it to you because if you read the error message, you'll understand it. But typically, people, when they first see the error message, they skip over it and just say something's wrong. So let's just pretend, I'm not going to tell you what I did there. I'm just going to show you really quick. So if I were to start this application, I get this error. A project with an output type, right there is our key, output type of class library, cannot be started directly. Why is that? Because we run user interfaces, not DLLs. Okay, so class libraries, we don't run them directly. We run user interfaces. A class library is not a user interface. So it says a project with an output type of class library cannot be started directly. All right, so how do we resolve that? Well, if you notice over here, let's just zoom in. Right now, demo library is bold compared to console UI. All right, it's a little more bold. If you right click on it, there's an option down here at the very bottom. Let's see if I can scroll, put on the page better. Set as startup project. That's what I did to make this error. Because the first project I add to the solution is the one that is the startup project. So if you add it in the order of user interface first and then library, you won't see this error. But at some point, you're going to come across it because you're going to, change out the user interface or something, and you'll see it. So to fix this problem, you say, well, we want to start the console UI. Well, right click on console and say set as startup project. Now it's the bold one. If I zoom back out and I hit start, no problem. It went ahead and started. Okay? So that's one thing you might see. Don't panic. Read the error message. It's very self-explanatory. And then you just need to know to right-click on your project and say set as startup project, about halfway down. All right, so that's really all there is to class libraries. Pretty easy stuff once you get through adding the reference and making sure you have the right startup project. Otherwise, it's just like you've already been doing. So let's look at our tip for today, which is store as much of your code in class libraries as possible. Now, here is the caveat to that, the exception to that. In general, don't put user interface code in your class library. You may be tempted to put a method in your class library that has a console read line or a console write line. You can do it technically. And there are cases where that makes sense. But in general, don't do that. Instead, do just the work in the class library and leave the reading and writing to the console to the user interface. Okay? Because not every user interface has a console or the same concept of console. Now, I say in general because you may end up deciding that you're working on a lot of console applications, and so you create a class library dedicated to console applications. It's a console class library, one that has certain things you always do. In that case, sure, you put it in a class library and then share it between just console applications, not WinForm applications, not MVC applications, just console applications. But it does allow you to have some specific tooling. But in general, class libraries are not to deal with user interface stuff. Just have them deal with C# code. Okay? The stuff that's not specific to one user interface. When we're talking about console applications, typically That's anything that says console is a user interface. But otherwise, it's not user interface. All right? So in general, put as much as possible in that class library. All right, your homework. Create a class library that holds a person class, and then use that class in a console application. Pretty simple stuff. Just maybe fill it in with first name and last name, and then spit it back out. Just so you can get used to the idea of adding that reference, adding the correct using statement, and actually working with that class. All right? Once you're done that, then move on to the next lesson.